I'm Anne Lounsbury. I know almost all of you, and I'm the chair of the Department of Russian Islamic Studies, here to introduce Tatiana Smoliarova. We're extremely glad to have Tanya here to talk to us about 19th century and late 18th century Russian literature. Tanya earned her PhD, double PhD at LGGU in Moscow and at the Sorbonne, and she works on 18th century and early 19th century Russian literature and culture, with particular focus in literature and architecture, literature and performance, poetry and poetics, and obviously she works on comparative literature too. And we're really happy to have her here to speak about a wondrous linkage, a round one metaphor in early Karamzin. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks you all for coming on this extremely nasty day. I'm very flattered, and it's really beyond rhetoric and beyond rhetorical formulas that I'm very happy and proud to be here. So I was initially planning to talk about this topic, Wondrous Linkage, one metaphor in early Karamzin. I was initially planning to talk about it in the fall 2018, and then I'm grateful to Anne for her flexibility. I just had to move it, but it was among other things, to commemorate 220 years since the poem on which will be focused today was written, and also 200 years since the most famous portrait of Karamzin was painted by Vasily Tropinin. I just think it's a very, it is expressive. Yeah, it is the most famous portrait, and I think it's really wonderful and very subtle. Here we see Karamzin in 1818, so when he has already published, or выбил, as he said, as he formulated this in Russian, gave out the first 8 volumes of the history of Russian state. So he was he was a court historian for already 15 years. Really one of the most established figures in the pantheon of authors. But the period with which we'll be dealing today, so the last decade of the 18th century, the 1790s, of course, one of the most interesting decades of world history. He looked somewhat. So we don't have a portrait of Karamzin in the 1790s. We have this portrait by Damuno Oktolani dating back to Karamzin in late 1780s, so more Karamzin as a young Scythian, as he loved to present himself throughout the letters of a Russian traveler. So we should just use our imagination, and we'll deal a lot with imagination today to imagine how he looked, to figure out how he looked in between. So in 1798, he wrote a very he wrote a very long and confusing, unclear poem. About 300 lines in length. I only show you part of it, and I will then show a part that we'll be interested in, that is called «Праты или несогласия стихотворца», «Pretty», so disagreements among makers of verse. Actually, that's not my translation. Surprisingly enough, an English translation of this poem exists. It's not very, it's rather free, and I thought, for instance, that I would prefer to substitute joining for linkage in the quotes that made the title for this talk. So in this poem, really I'm not going to torment you with all the 300 lines of this poem, overloaded with images and metaphors and other figures of both thought and speech. But this entire poem is actually about poet, poetry, and the place of poetry and poet in the society. And so he gives an image of, well, maybe not ideal, but well-functioning, decent society. So in the lines that you see in front of you, he describes actually what the man, the poet, sees. Maybe I won't abuse our time for quotes, but maybe I should read this. Does everyone understand Russian here? Yeah. So, and you have, just in case, you have the English translation. Когда ж глазам его явится блеск искусства в чудесности своей и в полной красоте великолепный град, картина многолюдства, разнообразное движение страстей, подобных бурному волнению морей, но действием ума премудро соглашенных и к благу общества законом обращенных, театр, где, действуя лишь для себя самих, невольно действуем для выгоды других. Машина хитрая, чудесное сцепление бесчисленных колес, ума произведения, но несмотря на то загадка для него, тогда певец села в восторге удивления, забыв свирель, берет для гимна своего золотую лиру петь, успехи просвещения, что был ты человек с природой один, ничтожный раб ее, живущий боязливо, лишь в обществе ты стал природы властелин, и в первый раз взглянул на небо горделиво. I can't say that it's the best poem ever written, Russian poetry, and even by Karamzin, but it's curious, and already from this first glance, from this first reading, we understand it's a very anti-Rousseauistic claim, right? That actually to overcome and to deal with nature, a man should actually be part of the society. But for today, I would be very, well, at the beginning I'm going to focus on really just several lines. Театр, где действую, once again, so theater, and right, we pronounce this word a little longer than usually it's pronounced in Russian. It's elongated and focused in this way. Театр, где действую лишь для себя самих. So we have this strange neighboring of two metaphors of this society. One theatrical, the other one industrial. So what interests me is, what is this wonderful, wondrous machine? What is this wonderful linkage? I say it's in that translation, joining. I was actually asked what would be better for сцепление, right? The main thing is that it's not a chain, but it's a kind of gear, right? Clutch, some kind of more complicated connection, maybe, I don't know, 3D connection of the countless wheels, right? So, and as I wrote in the description of this talk, it's particularly interesting to think about metaphors in this last decade of the 19th century, where the usual apocalyptic anticipations of the end of the century, going all the way from medieval anticipation of the end of the world, all the way through the famous Y2K, it enhanced by the events of the French Revolution, left the entire world puzzled and bewildered, and the cognitive power of metaphor is at the forefront. So metaphor, the image, helping us, or at least trying, making an attempt to help man, a poet, understand and describe what's going on. So I'm interested, particularly what tenor is behind this vehicle, to use the terminology of Ivor Richards, that I think fits particularly nicely here, where the vehicle is so mechanical and it's actually a machine. So which tenor behind this vehicle, and why theater and machine next to each other? First, when I got, when I just was curious about these lines, I thought that the answer, what was this machine, that the answer was pretty straightforward and suggested by Karamzin himself. So I thought that it was la Machine Domani, that was otherwise called machine, that was sometimes called Machine de la Joie by the authors of Encyclopedia Diderot de Lambert. So the famous machine built in time of Louis XIV in the 1680s, where 252 wheels and 64 pumps raised the water from the Seine to Marly-le-Roi, to the gardens, and to ultimately to the Versailles gardens. And it was really a marvel, admired by many Russians, first of all by Peter the Great, who visited it in 1717, and who was told to be musingly, to be drawing and musingly repeating the movements of the wheels during the dinner that followed his visit to Machine Domani. So if on the one end of the century there was Peter the Great, on the other one was Karamzin himself, who famously disliked Versailles, right, as he writes in Letters of a Russian Traveler. I'm not quoting the entire thing, where he said, Louis XIV and Le Nôtre so impressed my imagination that it was impossible to invent anything or to imagine anything other than it was. Actually, it's, I'm quoting, sorry, I should have put this, in Letters of a Russian Traveler in the most recent translation by Andrew Kahn, that is in general nice and has some interesting comments. But here, for instance, the Russian original says, Louis XIV and Le Nôtre, запечатали мне воображение, so basically sealed my imagination, closed my imagination, which of course for Karamzin was very important, because really, he, as he says, he could only see and admire this perfect symmetry. There was no emotion, right, that to be developed in time, which was so dear to him and to the entire culture of the picturesque. So he didn't like, or didn't particularly appreciate Versailles, but he did very much like Machine Domani, the backstage of Versailles, and he dedicates an entire letter, 122, to the description of Machine Domani. And he says, you have to be an engineer to appreciate the wonder of the aquatic engine at Paris, its horizontal and vertical motions, the pumping actions, and so on. The fact is that it collects water. The inventor of this mechanism was illiterate. Of course, that's another necessary note for Karamzin. It's a version of Noble Sauvage, although actually the inventor of Machine Domani was literate. He says, не знал грамоте. He did know grammaty, but that's not the main point. The more interesting thing is that before this conclusion about an engineer, he says that instead of giving you a prose description of this machine, I would rather give you a poor translation of the lines by Jacques Delisle, right, the author of Les Jardins, the Gardens, the most influential descriptive poem in, I would say, post-Lacanian period. So he said that he would quote from Delisle in his own translations, that he characterizes as poor, not without some coquetry. So he gives a long quote. Usually he quotes Delisle in French. Here he quotes it in his translation, but the key thing is that, and that's something that would be important for us today, later, the fact that he thinks that the machine with all its numerous wheels, the gear should better be represented by an artifice of poetry. Where not just the prose that where language does not have to struggle with anything, but with poetic language, with all the limitations imposed on it by rhythm and rhyme, and so that one, I'm never sure how to go, artifice, thank you, sorry. Yes, so the artifice of poetry to fit the language of description, to fit the object of description, such as machine. That would be important. So I thought that many wheels, and actually Delisle, so I thought that this singer of the village, right, Pevец села в восторге удивления, from the lines that we just saw, forgetting his reed pipe takes up the golden lyre for his hymn to sing the success of the Enlightenment. So given that Delisle was this most famous author of the Jardin, I thought that really that was him. And maybe that is him. But at the same time, it's more, at the same time, more and less complicated, this machine. By the way, Delille wrote one of his earliest poems in the 1760s, an entire long poem on a very efficient mechanical prosthesis for a soldier who lost his arm. And so, again, it's where the poet, as an engineer of words, tried to convey the engineering power of a device, its efficacité, its utility. But then, actually, the thing that, and so I didn't think that it was worth this observation, that I didn't think that it was worth giving a talk or writing about it. But what I was, as I'm interested in general in the history of the metaphor of the machine, at some point I just looked into, there is this multi-volume dictionary of Russian 18th century language, the blue volumes that stop on the letter O. Unfortunately, further volumes are not yet produced. Hopefully they will be, but the letter O was longer. Fortunately, I looked up the word machine, which is M, so I could look it up. And so I looked it up, and there were very few examples from the use of the word machine in Russian 18th century. One referred me, one that looked somewhat familiar, as I would show you, referred me to the book 2 of Moscow Journal. Moscow Journal, the periodical that Karamzin published when he came back from Europe. So that's the cover of book 2, and all these covers had the epigraph from Pope, right? That's also another thing to remember. Pleasures are ever in our hands or eyes, Alexander Pope. So Moscow Journal was published by Karamzin when he came back from Europe. He was rebuked for that by his older colleagues, among whom the Russian Christians to whom he belonged before he went to Europe, and who likely financed this trip, as Andrei Zorin. Yes, there are doubts whether that was, and there's an interesting, there was a suggestion that they did, but there is this recent article by Andrei Zorin and Lena Korchmina published in Cahiers du Monde Russe, where they discussed that it was actually more, also more less complicated. Anyway, people, his colleagues, rebuke him for the audacity of this entire thing, and for daring to improve, исправлять народы своими писаниями, to improve people with his own writings. So this, the core of the publication, at least of the first books of Moscow Journal, were actually the publication of letters of a Russian traveler, this half-real, half-fictitious account of his travel, published in many installments throughout, but also unfinished in the letter, because he didn't even reach, which is important, the description of the French Revolution before he was sick and tired of publishing this journal all alone for 2 years. But so it was mainly his own writings. Also, there were some poems by Dmitriev and Derzhavin and other people who wanted to support him. And of course, a very important part of this project of this daring, which was indeed a daring, and he was going to improve the people by his writings. And there were also writings and translations. Many translations, mainly from France, and as Andrei Zorin, whom I already mentioned, he dedicates the entire second chapter of his most recent book, The Emergence of a Hero, Появление героя, to letters of a Russian traveler, and to the way in which Karamzin brought, as he puts it, emotional matrices for all possible cases of love. So certain models, matrices of behavior, of reaction attached to certain events, etc., etc. So the quote containing the machine, I will show it to you, comes also from a translation. When I opened the Moscow Journal, I just saw from French, but it's easily identifiable. This quote comes from a story by Jean-François Marmontel. The story that, I don't forget about the machine, you will get it. From a story by Jean-François Marmontel that is called La Veillée, that is translated in English as Tales of an Evening, Вечер in Russian. So we know that Marmontel was extremely important for Karamzin precisely in this entire story of bringing a certain kind of sensibility, a certain way of feeling and reacting to various events for Karamzin. I have seen the author of the excellent fables, which although they appear to be written in an easy and familiar style, are perhaps inimitable and unique of their kind. Marmontel. Seeing him is not sufficient. You have to know him better, you have to chat with him about the happy times of French literature, which have gone, never more to return. The physiognomy of Marmontel is very attractive. Says in Russian. His tone shows that he has lived in the best Parisian society. Marmontel is past 60. He has married a young beauty and lives happily with her in rural retreats, looking in on Paris from time to time. When he talks about, again, the translation of excellent fables, we know that the main writing of Marmontel were his moral tales, les contes moraux. The translation of conte in Russian is always ambiguous. It's either сказка or повесть, and that's how they were translated now and then. So you see here, the main corpus of contes moraux was written in the middle of the century, published in 3 volumes, and we all remember the 3rd volume of Marmontel from Eugene Onegin, and Marmontel et Préciton, without much respect that Pushkin quotes it. But for Karamzin, he was really important. So it was in this rural retreat where he lived with a young beauty that he married that Marmontel wrote another body of new moral tales, nouveaux contes moraux, that were first published in Mercure de France, of which he was previously an editor, and then came out as a separate edition. And so one of this nouveaux contes moraux that he was writing when revolution was in Paris and he was in this retreat, that he wrote the tale that we're going to talk about and where our machine metaphor actually come from. You have this tale in front of you, and of course I do not think that it's a handout to be read at one time. I just want to leave it with you so that you can read it at night. And it's just one of 9 tales that are part of this. So Tales of an Evening, right? So the thing is that it contains 9 stories, and so it's about 100 pages. That's why it's hard to imagine that it was all told in one evening. So in Russian it was also, Karamzin first translated it as Вечера, and then for book publication as Приятный вечер. If you look at the introduction to these stories, you'll see, well, just for the sake of time, I did it in English. During the late disturbances at Paris, a few friends who had retired to the country from the confusion of the metropolis were at a loss from entertainment one evening, having exhausted their observations and speculative inquiries as to the probable issue of affairs, right? Revolution, which is Madame de Verval, the lady of the house, was herself very fond of storytelling and mistress of that accomplishment in a very superior degree, proposed that each of the company should by turns relate the happiest or one of the happiest events in their lives, which could be revealed with property. Already this introduction, so a group of, this is how Karamzin translates it, and actually it's curious how he changes his translation between the journal publication of 1791 and the book publication of 1794. Right, he in the first case, he says, «Скучись рассуждать о настоящем и будущем», and in the book translation, he says, «После горестных размышлений о состоянии бедной Франции», which reflects his permanently changing position, the attitude towards French Revolution that was studied, among other things, by Lotman. So already, the presence of frame narrative, people telling about happiest times of their lives, having a retreat from revolutionary Paris, already we understand what literary model is in front of us, right? It's a kind of Decameron-like story, and that's just a nice illustration of Decameron. So as the members of Boccaccio's Brigata who refused to get, as we remember, right, they go away from the plague of the Florence and refusing to get any novelle, the news, from outside, they replaced them with novelle, the stories, the new genre introduced by Boccaccio. As well as Boccaccio's Brigata, the company of friends described by Marmontel escaped now not from the plague, but from the plague of the revolution, tired of the news, right? Скучись, as we said, скучись рассуждать о настоящем и будущем, and share with each other the stories about the happiest moments of their lives. And we can see from the very beginning that, as in Boccaccio, the very act of storytelling is intended to unify the world that is falling apart, is intended to stitch together the fragments of this world, the world that is falling apart intellectually and morally, as it is described in Decameron, right? When the most important virtues, or maybe social graces, such as gratitude, generosity, and compassion, are sort of destroyed, and this disappearance of compassion marks the final failure of the community. So, and actually, it's not just the kind of narrative, the frame narrative that we find in Marmontel that is Decameron-like, but we also see that all the stories, again, unfortunately I don't have time to tell you all the 9 stories, although they're quite exciting, they all revolve around pity, generosity, gratitude, and compassion. And compassion is not only the social glue which holds together the fabric of human society, but also the textual glue linking several layers of the story, both in Boccaccio and in Marmontel. And also, without having time to talk about all of them, I can say that although one would expect from this stories written during the revolution by an old man, well, Marmontel was not that old, right? He was born in 1723, but in his late 60s, that it would be bits and pieces of nostalgia for old times. But foreshadowing that, I can say that no, that actually all 9 stories are 9 portions of program of Marmontel for, again, not a utopian, not an ideal, but more or less human, functioning, decent society that should be organized around these values. So Marmontel was publishing the 9 stories of La Veillée, the 9 stories, 9 tales of an evening, in 9 months, from January through September 1790, so in 9 installments. The first 6, yes, and it's curious that, yeah, and we see that he still sort of believes in the humanity and the possible good outcome of the revolution. When, for instance, Burke, when Burke already on the other side of the channel realized that nothing good would come, he was writing his reflections on the revolution in France precisely at the same moment. So, and it's very curious that it was so important for Karamzin to translate the text right away, only several months apart, right? Only several months separate the publication of the last story in Mercure de France and the first story in Moscow Journal. The funny thing is that Karamzin, he was still a young man, he was tired of these 9 stories of La Veillée, and he stopped translating it after the 6th story. maybe not tired. The first 6 stories are set in the countryside, the last 3 in Paris. And probably for Karamzin, this countryside part was more important. It was only his friends who persuaded him to finish the entire thing for the book publication of the New Moral Tales in 1794. But in 1791, he just published 6 stories. If Marmontel was publishing strictly 1 story per month, although they varied greatly at length, Karamzin's rate was different. He published now 1, now 2, now 3 stories. The story that you have, the story that you have in front of you is the story number 5, placed at the very center, because unlike Decameron, the number of the stories here is uneven, right? They are 9. So story number 5 is placed at the very center. Is told by Ariste, the alter ego of the author of Marmontel, as he admits in his memoirs. And in the English translation that also followed immediately in 1791, it is entitled The Dog. We'll now see 1. And it's also interesting that it came out in May 1790, so precisely when Karamzin was in Paris and met Marmontel, because the letter that I quoted you is dated by May 1790, although again, as Lotman and other scholars have proved, the chronology of letters of a Russian traveler is somewhat anamorphic. It's not real, it doesn't follow exactly. He edited a lot, but more or less it was late spring, early summer, 1790. So this story, entitled The Dog, starts, there is actually a frame within a frame, and Ariste, the storyteller, presents a situation in which the story happened, and that there was also a company of friends that would go often to the bank of Marne, of the other great river in Paris, and actually that's what they saw. He says, right, if you look at the English text, I was in the village, the neighborhood of it's a typo in English translation. It's not Clarenton, it's Charenton. It's Charenton. It's a famous bridge. Neighborhood of Charenton often made the bridge across the Marne the limits of our walks. So this is actually the Charenton bridge, how it looked more or less, and then what he actually describes. Well, I don't know which one you would prefer, in French, in Russian translation, or in English. But you would, well, first in Russian. Быстрое круговращение разных движений, частную выгоду устремляемых к цели общей пользы и вечная мена трудов и услуг заставляли нас удивляться в устроении общественного порядка чудесному делу необходимости. I like this expression very much. Le merveilleux ouvrage de nécessité. Какое искусное сцепление между бесчисленными колесами огромной машины. Do you recognize it? Right? Какая невидимая связь соединяет их? Какая причина приводит их всех в движение? Одна. Взаимная нужда. Besoin réciproque. Right? Here it's a little longer, but that's exactly what you have. One alone, the reciprocal want, and that it continues. The moral view of nature is like the physical one, and put in, just let's skip essential parts of social mechanism and put in motion by the same law of attraction. So we have this strange vignette describing a machine that was not there. It was just a bridge. And then he actually says, after describing this machine on page 2, he says, I here give you a specimen of our conversations, that you may not take us for silly loiterers on the Champagne road employed about nothing. So actually this image of the machine comes from, it's an image of a conversation. It's image of topics. They were talking about, they were producing this verbal image of the machine And he needs this image, Marmontel needs this image to introduce the story that follows. But the story that follows, it's not accidental that it's called The Dog, because it tells the story of a poor man with a dog. A very typical, again, it's a little bit difficult to retell it briefly. I will try to be as brief as possible. So this company of friends is sitting near the bridge, and then there is an old poor man with a dog. The old poor man asks the ladies, and the company is mainly female, whether they would buy his dog. They say no. Actually, that's it's actually the poor man with the dog is a very popular iconographic model, especially in British painting. So that's just a general picture, and this is exactly the dog that is mentioned in the story, the Wedge Spaniel. I didn't know, but I found this painting by Stubbs, who was, fond, if not of horses, then of dogs. Nice dog. But it's important that he's not a beggar, this man. The dog is not just a spaniel still. So the man asks to buy his dog. They first refuse, then the storyteller says, okay, I will buy it. And he gives them 6 livres. And he sees that the man is very upset, that he hides his tears in the dog, and he gives him the dog, and then he realizes that that's the only friend he has. So to make the not very long story, a short story even shorter, the storyteller finally gives him money, leaves him with the dog, asks him about his life story. He said that he's that he is a carpenter from Lorraine. That he was working, right, again, it's important that he's not a beggar. He says on page 53, thank heaven, said he, I lived 50 years by the sweat of my brow, and yesterday for the first time I suffered the humiliation of asking charity. I was a carpenter in Lorraine, and my trade, 53, and my trade gave me bread, but an accident disabled me from standing up to work. A splinter of wood occasioned an incurable sore in my leg. I'm going to Rouen to see my daughter. She is an excellent spinner and earns her livelihood in the cotton manufacturers. By the way, that's also important, that there are some invisible machines here, right? She's a spinner, there are spinning machines, there's the manufacturer. When with her, I shall want for nothing. But he said that his trip was too difficult for him, and he didn't have enough money, but he didn't look like a beggar, so he couldn't ask for charity, and so that's why he decided to sell his dog. So everything ends very well. They send him to a small hospital. His food is taken care of, and so finally he leaves with his lab, dog, money, and actually the storyteller says that while the poor man was still in the hospital, he was telling the story all the time to various guests. And they would say, how much you gave him? And he said, 6 livres. And they would say, oh, we would have given more. I said, wonderful, he is here. He's just next to you. So he did this kind of fundraising. So if you would give him, and so that's how it all. But actually, the thing is that unlike other stories that are of Lavillé, that are much more detective and much more eventful, here there's basically nothing. It's a small episode, very similar to an episode from Stern that was actually that's a digression. An episode, but with a minute, almost I would say microscopic analysis of emotions, facial expressions, gestures, shades of meaning, half turn of a head, of a hand, hidden tears, etc., etc. So very, very precise, very analysis of human behavior and of human emotions. So the question that we have is how this introductory mechanistic vignette with the machine, with its many wheels, how it is connected to this purely sentimental tearjerk story. Why is it placed at the very center of the entire narrative sequence, and to my mind can serve as a key to the entire story, to this 9 stories, and as a program, right, of the possible potential society. And I think that actually the answer can be found in the words that we saw, right, in this introductory vignette, when he says, and what is the spring that, it's page 49, right? And what is the spring that animates them all and puts them in motion? One alone, reciprocal want, right? So we see here definitely social, political, and economic hint. So I really think that the answer is to be found in these words, and they're pretty recognizable. So I think that the figure that connects all, not only Marmontel's, the story with the vignette, but also Marmontel, and makes it so important to Karamzin, and connects it to the, I would say, history of ideas of the 18th century, is, sorry, I just skipped, it's some of this tiny observations of how he would accept the charity. So it's Adam Smith, I think. We know that he authored two magnum opus, two major books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. Theory of Moral Sentiments, well known, that was first published in 1759 and had 6 editions in Adam Smith's lifetime, so he kept editing it till 1790, so he actually made an important addition to the last 6th edition shortly before he died. So initially it was a written version of his lectures on ethics that were actually addressed. I didn't know that, I read it in some comments, that the somewhat straightforward or repetitive style of Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I actually love as a text, that it was addressed to a class of approximately 80 boys in their mid-teens. They were not really students, they were the boys around 14, 15 years old, which explains preserve some kind of oral dimension and explains that they were actually initially the lectures written down. So we know that the key notion of Theory of Moral Sentiments, and we can say from the very beginning that actually that Wealth of Nations was translated in Russian very quickly, almost immediately, while Theory of Moral Sentiments was not translated until 1868. And it's another interesting question why it was 1868. So the key notion of the Theory of Moral Sentiments is the notion of sympathy, by which Smith understands something that we would now call empathy, the capacity of a person to put oneself in a place of another one and imagines oneself in this position. That's why the notion of imagination is so important. He says, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he, etc., etc. That would often derive sorrow from the sorrow of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require any instances to prove it. So sympathy in Theory of Moral Sentiments is at the core of making a moral judgment, not the action. There are different motives for action. Among them, the famous self-interest, or in terms of 18th century, amour propre. And that's why actually that's around this. There is this. It was actually around this opposition of sympathy and benevolence on the one hand, and self-interest on the other, that the famous yet completely artificial Smith problem emerged. it was described, it was actually created, this pseudo-problem, by the Germans in the 19th century. They tried to show that Smith first had some kind of altruistic reasoning, that everyone should be sympathetic and try not to make others suffer. And then that he actually went to France in 1766, talked to materialist philosophers, and decided to be egoistic, because the main notion of Wealth of Nations is self-interest. But it's absolutely obvious that, and now scholars agree, among them those who wrote the introduction to Theory of Moral Sentiments in the Glasgow edition of the 70s, that Theory of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations are a sequence of thoughts, that they are connected syntagmatically, not paradigmatically, that a society which is organized around sympathy, as Smith says, there can be a society where everyone loves each other. It's impossible and unnecessary. But if people would be able to put oneself, as was said, on the place of the other one, right? Okay, well, I'll skip this long quote. Then the society will function, right? And so if the society is organized in such a way, then one can also use his self-interest, because he is interested in not making others suffer, in not making, not seeing the sorrow of others. So they really, now we see that the two books complement each other, and the understanding of either is actually helped by studying both. And Zorin, he also writes that Karamzin understood this very well, this continuity between the books. So, of course, there were really, Adam Smith, after lecturing in Glasgow, gave up his chair and went to France in 1764. So actually, in 1766, the year when Karamzin was born in remote Simbirsk, Adam Smith was really interacting with the encyclopedists, the materialist philosophers. And there were some consequences, of course, from these contexts, among which I just wanted, I think it's curious, this representation of, this is a 20-pound bill, right? We have Adam Smith, and we have, of course, his one of his major ideas, the division of labor, as presented in pin manufacturing, and there is it's possible, so scholars think that that he might be the very idea of this division of labor. He could get partly from the representation of pin factory in encyclopedia, the épinglier, where the process is represented in this divided labor. And that this this image from encyclopedia influenced him, just it was this kind of visual inspiration for economic ideas. Of course, I always love the illustrations to the encyclopedia, this one too, right? They're all, there is actually my very favorite essay by Roland Barthes is precisely about the composition of plates for encyclopedia, and he writes about how this vignette is connected to this details, but it's a separate subject. Anyway, so again, the division of labor. There were different consequences, among other things. So, as I said, Adam Smith didn't learn all his economics in France. There were bits and pieces of the future Wealth of Nations already in Theory of Moral Sentiments, but he did get some ideas, and some ideas were shaped. Also, the other direction, but it's a separate subject, but I think that actually Diderot's paradox of acting was heavily, that Diderot started to write in the late 60s, was seriously influenced by Smith's conception of imagination, and this almost, the magic if possibility to place one to the in the position of another. But definitely there was no turnabout, and really these two books are connected. And Smith saw this kind of common denominator between market and human sentiments, and probably the best book, I think, written about Smith by James Otteson is called The Marketplace of Life. And it's curious that even in this tiny story by Marmontel, there is the trade of emotions and money, so there is some kind of economic dimension. So, and do I have like 10
Sure.
Okay, so it was important for Smith to make imagination tractable and to oppose it in a way to the unruly and masterable imagination as it was described in 1757 by Burke in his essay Inquiry into Sublime and Beauty. I think that the key thing for us is that what was once called by the British scholar Anne Janovitz the social Newtonianism, an attempt to apply the discoveries of Newton, first of all the organization of the universe, to the society, right? As Alexander Pope wrote in the essay Men on their own axis, axis. The planets run, yet make at once their circle round the sun, so two consistent motions act the soul, and one regards itself, and one the whole, which is, we know that Pope put the entire essay Men in rhyming couplet, making this universal gravity enhanced by the gravity of verse, again, right? In Smith, we find the expression of this Newtonian celestial mechanics transferred to the social and political worlds. So the Newtonian model of the universe becomes the model for social certainty. So I think that the best illustration for this entire notion of social Newtonianism is this painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, which actually also happens to be painted in this magic year 1766, when Karamzin was born in Simbirsk, Adam Smith was in Paris, and on the other side of the channel, Joseph Wright of Derby painted one of his candlelight pictures, a philosopher giving a lecture on the orrery in which a lamp is put in place of sun. So it's a typical Wright of Derby's manner of dramatic interplay of light and shadow, but it is Newtonian not only and not that much because we see here precisely those orbs, right, the planets running around their axis, not only because the philosopher giving a lecture resembles Newton, right, himself. There is definitely, and it's actually interesting that this falls under the category of conversation piece, but everyone is silent, even the philosopher giving a lecture. But the social Newtonianism here is present first and foremost in the composition, right? You see that it's a closed circle. We see one child with his back, so it's not only the you see. So there is one person and the child standing here. So they're all around the orrery, and this society comprises men, women, and children to whom the discourse on the universe is addressed. Although I think Karamzin was only born in 1766, but I think that this painting could also be a visual metaphor for his later aspirations for having this mixed audience of men, women, and children, and clear, lucid discourse addressed to all of them, this universal gravity that was drastically reduced by the 1790, when Karamzin was translating Marmontel, 1791 translating Marmontel. Here, definitely, this entire company is, as it said in Marmontel, is put in motion by the same law, attraction. And we know also that the word attracție came in Russian language connected to Newton and to his discoveries, which we now say is притяжение. Yes. Sorry. So I wrote myself, if I have time at the end. That's clear that I won't have time at the end. But an interesting thing that occupies me now, among other, is a certain rhythm of rapprochement of the humanities and scientists in 1760s when the social Newtonianism emerges, 1860s and 1960s, right, where we have the peak of actually semiotics and all attempts to make the humanities actually scientific, and it's a general thing, but really we can talk about it now. So for Smith, who really tried to see this ruled, organized universe in the universe itself, and we know that even before he wrote down theory of moral sentiments, he had writings on astronomy, history of astronomy. So he saw this in the universe, in the society, in language, and one through metaphor that we find in various writings of Smith is that of machine. This is from astronomy. Systems in many respects resemble machines. So system is one of his favorite words. A machine is a little system created to perform as well to connect together in reality. There are different movements and effort, etc. This is probably the most important one for us, which I dared illustrate with a wonderful drawing by Picabia. And actually, it's not that daring, because actually this feeling of the machine is not opposed to the human being, not killing the human being, but being complementary to that, to my mind, connects the late 18th and early 20th century to a certain extent. In every part of the universe, we observe means adjusted with the nicest artifice to the end which they are intended to produce. And in the mechanism of a plant or animal body, admire how everything is contrived for advancing the two great purposes. Sorry, I actually thought of, it's the wheels of the watch, yes, that I admirably adjusted to the end. That's why Picabia is called Réveil du matin, it's a morning alarm. Yes, this is, my central quote. Human society, when we contemplate it in a certain abstract and philosophical light, appears like a great and immense machine whose regular and harmonious movements produce a seldom agreeable effects. As in any other beautiful and noble machine that was the production of human art, I actually wrote it for myself, whatever tended to render its movements more smooth and easy would derive a beauty from this effort, and on the contrary, whatever tended to obstruct them would displease upon that account. So virtue, which is as it were the fine polish to the wheels of the society, necessarily pleases, while rust, that the vile rust, which makes them jar and grate upon one another, is as necessarily offensive. So I think that this vision of this image of the machine was just borrowed by Marmontel in his story, almost literally. And again, it was at the time when the machine was not opposed to the human being, and one may also think of another book that appeared in 1789, The Botanic Garden by Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, where the Botanic Garden is full of various machines. Among them, probably the most famous, the spinning machine, an upgraded version of spinning jenny, which makes us think back to this daughter of the poor man in Rouen who is a perfect spinner. Yes, and so Marmontel borrowed this image, and Karamzin translates this story. Because seemingly this image of the machine where everything is connected to everything is particularly important in this age of uncertainty, as we said, because it's a model of certainty. The last question that remains, okay, Karamzin translated Marmontel. Why would he have to go back to this in 1798? Why would he have to create this versified version? So we're now coming back to our initial quote. Театр, где действовали для себя самих невольно действовали для выгоды других, машины хитрые, чудесное сцепление, бесчисленным колесам ума произведения. So I think that actually that that the answer is precisely that 2 years before the end of the century, when again this apocalyptic feelings enhanced by historical events were so strong, that he needed, he was particularly interested in this image of connection, of gravity, and why he needed to versify it, probably for the same reason as he provided the first image of Machine Domani in his letter. On the one hand, to render the image of Gir by the linguistic Gir, but even more importantly, to add to the attraction, to the universal attraction of Mahmoutel, the attraction of rhyme and rhythm, and putting this in verse. It's actually interesting. There is a tiny article by Sergei Averintsev, which is 3.5 pages long and yet untranslated in English, which is called Rhythm как Theodicea, Rhythm as Theodicy, where Averintsev in a very subtle way talks about rhythm that puts people in terms, even with the most tragic events of their life or of literature. He compares rhythm even to the sky at which Andrei Balkonsky looks lying in the field. So he says also, Averintsev, who was, as we know, a priest himself, he says that the main thing that Pushkin did for Christianity was actually the rhythm, the Onegin stanza, the rhythm of Evgeny Onegin, because he said that Evgeny Onegin is a very tragic, actually it's a tragic story that leaves us with this lucid, with this very luminous feeling, precisely for the pace, for the pace of the rhythm. And it's interesting that rhythm is the very notion of theodicy, right, bringing us back to Leibniz, right, returns us to this period of 17th, 18th century optimism theories. And the very last thing that I wanted to mention was that not only that in 1798, Karamzin was, of course, already not just conceiving, but really thinking very closely about his future major book, The History of Russian State. He actually announced that he will be writing it as early as in 1793, closing the Moscow Journal, 10 years before he was appointed a court historian. So as he writes in his letters to Dmitriev, written in the 1790s, the images of Russian history floats in his imagination and in front of him, and he needs something to string them on. And at the same time, he wants to go away from pure chronology. He dreams of creating some kind of a more complicated structure, linkage, not just chain. And in his Profession de foi, his forewords to the history of Russian state, dated by December 7th, 1815, but thought through for all the previous years, he says, but the ordinary citizen, I quote not from the very beginning, but the ordinary citizen too should read history. It reconciles him to the imperfections of the manifest order of things as something real in all ages. Right, the imperfect order of things, particularly acutely felt at the end of the century. So something should reconcile, some kind of linkage, of wondrous linkage of machine. And he also writes there, the reader will notice that I do not describe events one at a time by years and days, but combine them so that they may be more readily imprinted on the memory. The historian is not a chronicler. The latter considers only chronology, whereas the former is concerned with the nature of events and their interrelations. So again, right, for history, he also looks for a different kind of structure where the memory would be imprinted. So I think that it's actually, he also gets back to the machine in some other writings, but he's creating this art of memory that is the key thing for him, all the more so that he deals and insists on only dealing with remote history, right, when he was offered to write something about contemporary and recent history. said no, I want it in clair obscur. And the funny thing is, yes, so I say that the image of sцепление, non-linear, sophisticated special structures he's looking for. The funny thing is that it was in 1966, it's completely, as Pushkin would say, бывают странные сближения, but in 1966, when bicentenary of Karamzin was somehow maybe not celebrated, but thought about in Russia, and when he was re-actualized, that it was also in 1966 that one of the most famous books about art of memory, actually the Art of Memory by Francis Yates, came out in England, and on the other side of the channel, Stravinsky published his Empire de l'imaginaire, the major work on imagination. Of course, neither Stravinsky nor Yates were not thinking of Karamzin, but it's interesting the two most important things for him, art of memory and imagination, were celebrated in the same year. I think I will stop here.
Tanya, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And we have time for some questions. And I'll let you field the questions yourself, if you can see everybody okay.
Okay. I think that everyone is tired, and I apologize for it. Yeah.
No, I think everyone is mesmerized by all this intricate connection that you're building. It's like you're such a comparatist, and you see, I think, all these commonalities and connections with things that people might not otherwise see. And so I wanted to ask you to think about, you talked about the transmissions and the connections, and you put together Newton and Marmontel and Pope and Karamzin. And I was wondering about the moments when the mechanism fails, right? There are moments of mistranslation. How these things obviously have a lot in common, as you convinced us, but what are their differences? How does the machine work differently, both aesthetically, and economically in France versus in Russia? How does the metaphor travel? And thinking about this kind of problems in connections and in transmission, I also noticed Adam Smith talks about the rust in the machine, right? And Karamzin talks about the imperfections. And so I was wondering about the place that they have for these moments when the machine breaks down, and whether, you have there the ordinary citizen. Is it because of a particular type of citizen that this machine breaks down? Is it, who's left out of this beautiful mechanism?
Thank you, Christina. These are all, of course, wonderful and big question. So just the very first question, or at least how I understood it before you continued, was when mechanism fails, which, well, you explained what you meant then by translation, but my first thought was that actually at some point, many years ago, when I was still in the society, actually, Boston, I was still pretty young, and I was completely confused by the abuse of the word modernity. Modernity was everywhere. Modernity in the conference, modernity here, modernity there, in all the book titles. And I realized that I didn't understand what it meant everything and nothing, and I started asking various people from various spheres what they understand by modernity. They gave me various answers, interesting and more and less interesting. And there was one visiting professor at Harvard at that point, many years ago, Isabel Armstrong. She's from London and being a specialist in Victorian literature. She was teaching a seminar on optics and something which I was auditing. And she told me, well, it's very easy. Modernity, it's actually when I also learned for the first time what was social Newtonianism. Modernity is the end of social Newtonianism. So modernity is the moment when the mechanism fails. modernity starts when all this gravity, but it's just, another one and unsatisfactory definition of modernity, but where precisely it connects, it defines modernity precisely at the moment when the universal gravity stops acting, right? When the great chain of being in its kind of updated and upgraded 18th century version is no longer, right, is weak, right, towards the end of the century. But when you explained your question, well, how the metaphors travel is actually the question that interests me most. What happens precisely? Because, people also need to learn how to use metaphors as well as they learn how to use machines. One of my favorite also quotes was that Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1803 or in early 1800s, they went regularly to the public lectures on chemistry by Humphrey Davy. And when they were asked what they were doing there, Coleridge said, I'm renewing my stock of metaphors. So they were renewing the stock of metaphors, but if chemistry is universal, the machine, yes, machines are not. And it's very interesting to see in each particular case what travels, the metaphor or the machine. In the case of and Chadaev actually in one of his philosophical letters say that Europe and Russia has one thing in common, steam engine. But as far as the machines are concerned, for instance, spinning machines, the English machine, this graded version of spinning jenny, was ordered by widow Empress Maria Feodorovna in England and brought to Russia and then entered Derzhavin, this was another. But of course, another thing that is interesting and that interests me is what happens to this most archaic metaphors, Indo-European metaphors of spinning and weaving. What happens in the 18th century when the Industrial Revolution changes the process and when the old spinsters are jennied away, as one English poet of the 18th century said. So whether the metaphor disappears for poetic creation of spinning and weaving, or it changes to be the machine of poem. As for the third part, so I say with each device, with each engine, it's different. That I was working on the magic lanterns, like the objects, they traveled, and the metaphors that were attached to these objects traveled with them. The last part of your question on the imperfection in Karamzin and Rust in Smith and who is left out, I don't think that Karamzin talks about someone who on the contrary, he says that even the ordinary citizen needs history. When he says that he has to put him in terms, it reconciles him to the imperfection of the manifest order of things, is precisely to show that disparate, fragmentary events are actually connected. Maybe they're not connected in two-dimensional space, but they have some common roots, or there is a kind of linkage. So as far as I understand, I wouldn't connect this word by Smith and these words by Karamzin. But actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Burke, whose reflections are also full of metaphors, reflections on the Revolution in France, at some point there is an image of broken machine, also rusty machine or something, where the machine where one of the wheels, one of the gears is not working and everything falls apart.
But there seems to me in that paragraph to be some sort of threat, right? Here is the ordinary citizen who might be discontent, right? And so the knowledge of history would calm his discontent, reconcile him to society. What if that ordinary citizen is not reconciled by the reading of history? What if the upset or the problem with today is not calmed by reading the whole history? What will happen then? So there seems to be an undercurrent of
yes, it's interesting to think about it. Yes, I agree.
Thank you, Glenn, for this, as always, virtuoso presentation. I just have 3 questions of small clarification questions. So one of them has to do with this very intriguing thing of, so in the Karamzin quote, «Ума произведения, но несмотря на то загадка для него». Right, so up until you mentioned human art, up till the last quote from Adam Smith came up, I was very intrigued by this because it wasn't coming up before. Where is this right? What is this doing? And then and then when you said human art, ума произведения, exclamation point, that sounded sort of right, but I guess I wasn't 100% convinced.
I see. It was not intended for public
I know,
application. I just copy pasted
no,
my
but as
own.
soon as I saw it, I also thought, is that ума произведения? And
No.
then, because up until then, I thought,
as in any, that was production of human art. I'm sorry, once again.
no,
So the question is.
no, so yes, so I'm coming to the question. So ума произведения, но несмотря на то загадка для него, sounds almost Germanic, right? Because if you read Hegel, for example, on civil society, what you end up getting is this very metaphor of, in civil society, all the passions are released, all the accidents, are allowed free play, and then except for the reason that shines through all of that, right, and organizes all of that free play, I suppose. So this idea of the reason, and then reason on 2 levels, right? Ума произведения, in the sense that it's us who are acting in our own self-interest on the one hand, and on the other hand, недоступно для него. So we, from within the position from within the position at which we pursue our private interests, we don't understand or are incapable of understanding the reason that guides it all, providentially, almost, right? And I guess that's another metaphor that keeps coming up in relation to Smith, right? This kind of providential logic organizing human society. So I guess so this first question is, what else can we make of here? Is there potentially another provenance for this, or just your thoughts about this? And the second quick question is, in Adam Smith, basically all of them are sort of lexical clarifications. In Adam Smith, you have this rust that Christina mentioned, opposed. So it's a strange kind of metaphor, right? Because first rust is opposed to virtue, right? So virtue, which is, as it were, the fine polish to the wheels of society, necessarily pleases, while rust, like the vile rust, right? So he means rust in 2 different senses, right? Does he mean rust here in the sense of rustic, right? Because I guess
Just start asking myself. No, I don't think it was a typo. I just.
No. I mean, so the question is, what does he mean by virtue, right? What is this virtue that polishes the wheels of society? Because it's not Victorian virtue, it doesn't seem
No.
like
It's really a virtue that is more, I think, with this social grace.
social grace.
Yes, and I
so
think
then
that's-
rust would be rustic.
Yeah, I
Right.
think so. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. So then rust would be rustic.
Right.
And then the last question is just the question of the theater metaphor, which doesn't come up anywhere else.
yes. Okay. So thank you. Yeah. All the. I think that the second question, rustic. Thank you very much. It's a nice observation. I will write it down and think about it. The first about the definitely providence is here. And it does sound somewhat Germanic, and we know, right, that Karamzin he was translating Marmontel, but he was also editing La Facteur, right, and his German connections were also important. And there was this idea of the civil society. I think that actually this разнообразное движение страстей, подобно полному волнению морей, но действием ума, right, again, премудро соглашенных и к благу общества законом обращенных, actually this passions, or how it translated, movement of passions most wisely reconciled. I have I'm still thinking about these lines, and all of a sudden I'm mistaken, and that's why I don't even touch it. But when rereading A Month in a Country by Turgenev, and seeing this small model of the world in the estate, what happens is that I started looking into Turgenev and Smith, and it's at the same time that Theory of Moral Sentiments, more or less at this time that is being translated. Also, no, Month in a Country is earlier, but Turgenev could read it in French or English. That the small model of the world, where actually really there is some inner law, and that the passions, that everyone's passions, that they try actually to practice almost the Smithian sympathy towards each other, not making pain. And that when Stanislavski was staging Month in a Country in 1909, he made men wear corsets because they were they had to be like that, and that was a kind of I don't know even how to say, inner plastic image of controlling oneself and controlling the passions. And actually, so I have some kind of and what the Month in a Country was translated, surprisingly to me, by Isaiah Berlin, and he has an interesting introduction to this translation, and actually also the ideas that he introduces in this introduces in the introduction. Sorry, he talks about in the introduction, he introduces in the introduction and made me make this connection. Sorry, I've talked too much. So, but that actually connects us to the theater. I realize I didn't say anything about that because we didn't have time. But I think actually when he says «театр, где действую лишь для себя самих, невольно действуем для выгоды других», it's almost an exact quote. It's the word or rephrasing of Diderot, and Paradox of Acting was not published actually in Diderot's lifetime, but it was published in parts of it in literary correspondence. And so Diderot says literally, il en a du spectacle comme d'une société bien ordonnée. So the spectacle of theater is like a well-organized society where one sacrifices something for the profit of the others. And actually, that in an interesting. So I think that bless you. That would drive me too far away. I wrote an article on. I once found a copy of Paradox of Acting by Diderot, annotated by Stanislavski, just in the Museum of Moscow Arts Theater, not on a, highlighted with some comments. Stanislavski first read it seemingly in French, but then he got back to it in 1923 when he got back from the States, when he was renewing Moscow Art Theater, and the new translation was published with Lunacharsky's preface. And Stanislavski really, it's a precious work, and so I just wrote about these comments. And it's interesting that Stanislavski first practiced what would be known as his system during the rehearsals of A Month in a Country, and he would. It's okay. I'll stop here. But there are some more connections, but they would be too remote. But answering just your question about the theater, I think that it's this theater of the society. So it's the machine of the society and the theater of the society, and both metaphors come from Smith. They might be mediated or not mediated. As in Christina's question, with metaphors, I say we rarely know if there is an object and certain figures of speech, certain rhetoric attached to that. What comes first? The object is just being moved onto new soil, or the metaphor, and it's all it functions in a way metonymically. Like this word by Uspensky, Europe as metaphor and metonymy, and the entire reception of European culture in the 18th century were those pars pro toto, were small elements taken and then in hope of reconstruct the whole.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I just want to say that I think a talk like this, in many ways, accomplishes a version of what you're talking about. I mean, it's all, you get an Onegin stanza feeling from a talk like this, that there are these wondrous linkages out there in the world, and at a historical moment when the world feels very broken, I think that it's especially
That hopefully will be
useful.
reconciled with imperfection.
Exactly,
Will be
exactly.
manifest
But
in
also
other
we have to
things.
rebuild, right?
Yes.
Thank you.